On behalf of Direct Agents, I'm Dinesh Boaz, and this is The Blueprint. The Blueprint showcases entrepreneurs, creators, innovators, and thought leaders. Today, we feature Tim Saccenti from Setta Studio. Tim is a renowned photographer and video director, and he has worked with some of the biggest names in the world, including brands like Nike, Audi, and with artists like Travis Scott, Lana Del Rey, and Run the Jewels. I'll also be joined by my colleague Maddie Fantle, who heads up our in-house creative team, Future First Studio.
Thanks for joining us today, Tim.
Thank you for having me.
I'm not going to say, how's it going today, but I want to say, how you, I guess, navigating the world today, because everything's upside down, and it's awesome that we can connect over this Zoom call like everything else virtually. But what's your world look like today?
Well, yeah, this is taking place during the kind of height of our global pandemic. So there's a lot of social distancing, which can be a little tricky when you're a portrait photographer and rely on face-to-face collaborations. But it does also make you, realize just in general in the worlds that we navigate how much time you're actually in your normal day-to-day is actually wasted just by nonsense. So in that way, it's kind of refreshing. You just in my world, we're just myself and my creative partner, Dina Chang from Setta Studio, have been able to focus more back on our personal projects and finishing projects that we started, and all the things that just kind of seem to just like get caught up in the millions of conference calls and meetings and ridiculous things that we normally have to do just as we're producing everyday projects. Like in our world for photography, the actual taking of the pictures and going into the studio and shooting stuff is probably maybe only about like 5% of the time that's actually spent on things. Mm-hmm. So, and also working in small teams, and we work with a lot of our teams all around the world virtually. It's not actually day to day isn't that much different physically. There's a studio here in the building that I'm in now, so that is allowing us to be able to shoot still life and do our experiments and all the things we would normally do when we're hiding away doing our research and development phases. So as far as creatively, it's not that much different. And like I'm saying, our collaborators are like global, and most of them are working digitally, so they're still be able to create things. Which it's quite an interesting time actually, because people are still connected, and you just realize that you actually, I'm sure you guys know, when you live in New York, you end up not even really seeing most of your friends or even your collaborators more than a few times a year.
Right.
Because you're usually so busy or people are traveling. So it's not socially massively different, to be honest. Mm-hmm. We're just actually more efficient.
Right. We're seeing that too. Just efficiency and time on like actual output of work is actually more we're seeing than pre-pandemic, I guess. So.
Yeah, it's quite curious. You wouldn't expect that, but then you realize, actually, I can get what used to take 12 hours and get done in 3 hours, right? Because we're not being distracted constantly.
Right. Yeah. I think it's going to change the way we work forever. I think.
Yeah,
I hope so.
It's totally an adjustment for New Yorkers too, who are constantly on the run, always going. And now it's like New Yorkers have to stay still for a bit. And it is an adjustment, but it's interesting to look at our lives this way and see what it's like.
Yeah. And see what your relationships are like, and who the people in your world are you actually like considering, the people you're checking in on, the people you're caring about, and the people and the way you're thinking about. My hope and the hope for us is that maybe some of this will take down the tone of some of the celebrity tyranny that's like infected the entertainment worlds and creative worlds that we work in. Right. Because you see that kind of, in the shadow of this serious situation, that they actually maybe aren't that important.
Mm-hmm.
Right.
Yeah.
No, that's exactly right. So I guess, getting into your story, and so you mentioned Setta Studios, which we've checked out. It's obviously you guys are making some amazing work, but getting to where you are today, maybe just walk us through the story. I know you've been shooting for probably over 2 decades now, but talk us through like how you got to Setta Studios today.
Right. Well, as you know, we were lucky enough, at the time at least, I was lucky enough to grow up near New York City. And it might sound bizarre, but like, you know, in the 90s and kind of just at the early part of the internet, I don't think people even knew that you could, if you were outside of the city, people didn't even know that being something like a photographer was an actual job. That wasn't like something that like you didn't really know anyone like that if you were from the suburbs like myself, and your parents probably had blue collar jobs or something similar. Right. So I feel like I was lucky enough to grow up near enough to New York City where I had access to a different variety of people and influences from the museums and even from the bookstores and magazine stands, things like that, going into being able to easily have access to the city and go and see, you know, French Vogue or at the time, you know, the Face magazine, ID, all of this cultural influence from Europe that if I was in the Midwest probably would have no idea about. And so from being interested in music, having access to New York City, I was lucky enough to be able to go to the School of Visual Arts and meet some photographers, European photographers, who did this kind of style of photography that I was very interested in, that kind of went with the music of the time, this sort of electronic, immersive, emotional music. And there was a style of photography that was quite immersive coming from Europe that had to do more with lighting, art direction, creating a tone, not snapshot photography, not reportage. And this really like touched the nerve with me. And once I discovered that and how and who the people were making this type of work, which was very unknown. Now you know what photographers look like. They have Instagrams, you see behind the scenes. At the time, they were just like obscure names of people. You had no idea what anyone looked like. You had no idea how they made anything. So the only way to have access to that world was to go and actually find these people and work for them. And luckily, being in New York City, I was able to work for a lot of these really amazing European photographers and learn kind of how to work with lights and how to work with art direction, how to work with different types of films and cameras, and that over a few years of doing that sort of gelled with my interest in electronic music and music in general, culture and fashion. And then eventually this, by symbiosis, kind of came up with this style that I kind of have continued to work on to this day. Then from having that influence and access to those things and interest, over the years, we've had different collaborators trying to mix in technology with photography, mixing in 3D, mixing in coding, mixing in 3D printing at this point. And then 2 years ago, I started working with my collaborator, Dina Chang, who is also an artist and amazing creative director. And we decided we would start a studio together, which is the Setta Studio. So we will work on, when a project comes in, we both have a similar aesthetic. She is from Los Angeles, so it has a little more of a wild style aesthetic. Right. Me, from being from New York, is a little bit more, I would say, somber and a little more Baroque. Yeah. So right. Our styles together, kind of merged into this, like, even to me, what I feel like is more than the sum of its parts style of a little more fashion and beauty from her end of the world and wildness. Like, she's very into Mondo magazine and things like of that era, as well as European fashion. So instead of it just being where my work was going, which was much like we do call Baroque futurism, where it was more minimalist and kind of moody and expressionistic. Now we've combined it into this more wilder version of that content-wise, because she pushes that envelope. I bring in my lighting techniques, art direction, and our teams, and we just like build on each other's styles and interests and immense library of insane books that we have. Right. Awesome. And that's where we're at the moment.
Well, one thing I heard you say about your work now at Setta Studios is you can be as weird as you want if it looks beautiful. And I loved that. I think that was great.
Yeah, that's Dina's quote. Can be as weird as we want as long as it looks beautiful. And that's kind of also like this just a approach to things, because we're both from very professional backgrounds. She can produce very high-end TV commercials. and be creative on a very, very sophisticated level. I have also shot a lot of things, like we're saying, for Nike, PlayStation, Sony, Audi, very high-end commercial work. Mm-hmm. So we feel like as long as we can deliver the piece in a very high-end manner, we're allowed to push it into this bizarre territory. It gives us almost like a license to do that, because we know that what we're going to deliver is going to still have the finish, the fit and finish and polish of a car commercial, and also that we can on the fly modify things and still keep our style within it, because we both are very professional backgrounds. We're not coming from an approach of just trying to be weird for weird's sake.
Mm-hmm. Well, I guess no, that makes sense. And one of the things that in seeing the video that Adobe did on your studio, which was really insightful. I mean, I guess talk us through that process. So if a client comes to you, how much of a creative field you allow into the shoot from the client side versus this, this like aesthetic that you guys bring that obviously is pushing the boundaries of an idea. Yeah. How much of a box do you create for a client?
Well, the best work that we do, we feel, is very collaborative with the client. Now, the client might be a musician, or the client might be a brand, as far as like Nike or something, or the client might just be like a portrait of someone who we know who's a friend or artist or something to that level. Right. So I think the way that we work best is when someone has an idea that they're trying to express, and we are basically like transmuting that through our process, which is basically someone comes to us and says, someone came to us recently and said they want to do something that had to do with like out of body experiences. Wow. And transcending like space and time. Mm-hmm. So we have a conversation with them. We have all these visual ideas that start bouncing around. We will take their basic emotion that they're trying to get to, as well as their visual aesthetic, like what will work for them, whether it's color scheme or if it's a portraiture, what's going to also be flattering, and also what's possible within the limitations of, say, the budget or time or something like that, which is also really important. Limitations are very helpful in these situations sometimes. If you know you have $100,000 to work with, that is a certain kind of approach that you can have compared to a $500 project. Mm-hmm. So we basically, Dina and I will sit together, go through our book collections, go through our DVDs, pull up all the references that we have from our years and years of just researching, which is basically what we do all the time, always looking at new books and magazines, films, obscure things about Egyptology or the occult, as well as like very high-end fashion things, the history of science, things of that nature. We pull all those together and try and distill it down to something that we can present back to the client. Some of it's just problem solving, like, oh, we need this thing to glow. This thing has to glow in the dark, maybe. Mm-hmm. Like maybe that's the product. So we try and figure out the problem solving part first, and then we present it back to the client, maybe in 1, 2, or 3 variations of what we think will work, that has our aesthetic, and then that we bounce back and forth with them to get it to a place where they are happy, or they can sell it up their chain of command in their company. So we're hitting like the notes as far as like what the story is that has to be told for the product or for the music or whatever it is that we're dealing with. Right. But generally speaking, because the style of the work that we have been doing is pretty strong, mm-hmm. Generally they're going to come to us knowing that they want something like that. Like they say, we want something that has this sort of, color scheme or lighting scheme or art direction or something. They're right. Not going to come to us asking for like a street style type right. photography shoot or a naturalistic type thing. And we are very idea oriented. We want there to be like a story built into the ideas, and so we have something to work from that's like built into the DNA of it. And then everything else around that is just like problem solving to express that idea.
Yeah, you mentioned, yeah, that makes complete sense. And it's really interesting. You mentioned how you guys do a lot of research to help inspire you when you're crafting these projects and creatives. But do you ever have a time when you're stuck and you can't feel creatively inspired? And do you have any tips for other creatives out there on some things you might do to, get the creative juices flowing and help you craft a vision?
Yeah. Well, first off, if we're going to work on a project, generally, say it's a music video or it's mm-hmm. a portraiture, we're quite lucky in that we have something like a basis to start with. We have their song, or we have their story, or we have their product. And then that is usually like the main impetus, because we can't just throw our ideas at something that it doesn't make sense for.
Right.
So if that part isn't clicking, isn't doing something, then maybe it's not the right project for us to do, first off. So that's something to consider. If we are excited about it, but kind of stuck, we have different ways of dealing with that. Mostly going. I mean, the thing, when you used to be able to go out in New York City, now we're not allowed to. When we go out in New York City, we can go and go to the bookstore, go to the museum, fill our heads with things. I found that for me is really inspiring. Getting away from the computers, getting away from the phone, and those distractions that come with that. Even if you just put it down for a few hours, you'll be surprised how much clarity that you gain from being away from the noise of that. Right. And talking with friends. We have a lot of amazing collaborators. We're very lucky. People who work in different mediums than us, 3D or coding or set design or something. Just go have a conversation with them, not necessarily about your project, but what are they interested in general. Being interested in other people and other people's work makes you inherently interesting person. Right. So by being interested in other people and getting outside of yourself, that seems, for me at least, that frees me from the pressure of coming up with the idea, and then something via osmosis or alchemy of the moment seems to start, the gears start moving in motion. So sometimes you just have to forget completely about what you're trying to solve, and just think about something totally different.
No, that's really great. That's really great advice, I think, for anyone that's stuck on a challenge. Just getting out, putting those things down, shutting them off, and then going and exploring something else.
Totally. And something that has nothing to do with your medium, like in New York, it might be, we're going to go look at this building and just look at the architecture of it and question, why is the architecture like this? Why is the entrance to this building so small and then it opens up into this vast space? There's reasons for that. So that when you go into the vast space, the contrast feels different because you had to go through a small entryway to get there. There's millions of things that are happening that are very thought out by people way smarter than us. So if you,
no, that's really great. So getting into just the sort of for the creators out there and for the photographers and videographers out there, just talking about that process with you in the studio and with Setta Studios. We got a glimpse of that in the Adobe video of just, and me personally seeing the video, it brought me to kind of the music world where you're you've got this piece of content, you're at the mixing board together, and at the computer together, and you're trying to make a beat almost. Talk to me about that analog process. And I know your partner mentioned, it's got to be a beautiful image to begin with, and then from there, Tim and I kind of just chop it up. So it's talk to us about that. What that looks like.
Yeah. Well, basically, when we start the process, we'll have a call, and both Dina and I are writing the ideas down from the call. She'll probably start doing some certain sketches, and I'll start doing some certain sketches, and we'll figure out where the two worlds that we're thinking overlap into something that seems doable. This is not a collaboration that I think would work for everyone. We have very similar ideas that are different enough that they create an interesting contrast or tension, but the language is, we have a lot of the same references. So there's a lot of inferred understanding about what direction we're going in. She has a very, very detailed eye for things. And I have kind of a broader stroke, more, I would say the more broad emotional stroke. And then Dina is quite detailed, which is very, that's sort of the finishing process. She's very intuitive about how she does that. So say in the Adobe piece, we had the concept was, how do we express this artist's Basic is his name, who's a bass electronic artist. How do we express this? So we wanted to use light. We wanted to use some of the techniques we'd been doing in research and development using light painting, because we felt that kind of had the aesthetic of his music. We also wanted to make something that was visually exciting, because the music itself is quite bombastic.
Right.
So we knew we were going to do light painting. So Dina would go and pick out certain images that she felt would work with the light painting. We go in the studio and test them. And then I might take some of those and put them in Photoshop and do some digital adjustments. So we're bouncing back and forth, and she's kind of art directing the project while I'm doing some of the more, where I'm kind of exploring it in Photoshop or through different color schemes or something digitally. And then we bounce back and forth till there's something that we think looks good, but will also work with this specific technique. Mm-hmm. Then we go and do the shoot, and on set, I'm sometimes operating the camera, sometimes Dina is. And we work together with a live monitor, so we can bounce back and forth again, like live, to say, between each shot, we pause and we look at the monitor together, and we decide what direction to go in, if something's working or not. There's kind of a creative discussion at each step. Right. And then we pick the pictures together. And then we go, say in the Adobe piece, we were using a device called a tachyon, which is an analog, glitch piece of equipment to adjust the images. Now we will go in and probably, we'll operate that and come up with hundreds of different variations. And then I would probably, in this particular case, I would take them into Photoshop, start layering them in, and then we would bounce back and forth with her feedback until we get something that we're both happy with. And then we would probably send it off for finishing to like a beauty retoucher or real retoucher. So basically, like each step of the way, we both are working separately, and then we come together with the ideas, and then we kind of separate again to work on our pieces individually, and then we bring them back together. It's sort of like a intense moments together working on it, and then separate for each of us to have our like creative space. Then we come back together, and we do that until basically led up till the minute we have to deliver it.
Wow. And then you kind of are feeling that it's gotten to that place that you're both connected on it before you're delivering it?
Yes. Yeah. Yeah. So there's usually many versions of things before we deliver them.
That's great.
Hopefully we have bought enough time so that we can make something. And then some of these things, it just depends, especially if we're working on things that are more abstract. It depends on how you're even feeling that day. Mm-hmm. Sometimes you are just feeling like this doesn't work, and then you sit on it for a few days and you realize, oh, actually that was really good. We should go back to that one. It's really subjective.
Got it.
Right.
And that's what's helpful about having, at least in this situation, what's been helpful for, I think, both of us is having, a collaborator. Where photographers themselves usually don't have that. So that someone can say, you could make this better, or we should do better, or actually this is done. Because you can just get lost in a feedback loop of your own mind if you're doing this type of work where it's really exploratory.
Yeah, no, that makes sense. And it's nice to have a partner that can, one, help push you, but also help ease your mind and say, no, this works, get out of your head.
Totally. Yeah. And I think most photographers, they spend most of their time kind of alone working on things traditionally in the darkroom or now in the computer. And like I was saying, the photography part being on set is only like 5% of the time you're spending for the most part. So there's a lot of time to like kind of get lost in your own mind if you don't have, a team around you or collaborators around you pushing you or telling you to stop.
Right,
I think musicians have this problem too, especially like electronic musicians. It's always a good question is, to say like, how do you know when something's done?
Right.
Yeah.
Right. Yeah, that was going to be actually one of our questions. And now it makes sense that, you could play a loop forever the same way you can probably chop up an image forever. So it's like, it's interesting to see kind of how you guys are kind of setting the sort of end of that idea together.
And I think that it also has to do with the type of work that we do, which is not supposed to be capturing reality. It's supposed to be pushing it into this ethereal type of world of the mind.
Right.
I think it was Brian Eno who said to push things as far as they go and then retreat to a safe space. So often some of our imagery, I mean, if we're doing commercial projects, it's quite different. There's like parameters we have to hit, and we're just trying to make it, trying to excel and make it as high quality as it can be. But when we're doing our own work, there is no necessarily parameters. So often there's very bizarre versions of the things we're working on, but then we pull it back into something that is a little more readable or understandable, or also something where you can't necessarily tell how it was done. So there no one can come in and reverse engineer the process to kind of break the code of how we made something.
Right. You mentioned that reverse engineering the video as well. And that's interesting that that's something that is part of the way you guys work.
Yeah, because there's many steps. It's never just like one light that we're pointing at something that if you do that, it's going to look the same. Even our team of assistants, even if they set up the lights the same way each time, they still can't get it to look exactly the way it does when we walk onto the set and do one little tweak here or a mirror here or a certain kind of hazer we're using or a certain kind of laser that we're using, something like that. So we always try to have at least one small extra step that is one part of the process, whether before we shoot, during the shoot, or after we're shooting, that adds the one twist that you can't quite figure out what we did. And by doing that, I think it's made it so in some ways it just keeps the work fresh, but also makes it so, especially in the world we're in now, where everyone is a photographer, it's quite ubiquitous. That makes it so that people are still relying on you to do that one little thing that you can do that no one else can do. There's so many good photographers now.
Absolutely, there's amazing work out there, and as a creative, I think that's interesting. So, is that something that you set out thinking like, we're going to come up with this thing, or is that just something that developed over time? That's like, okay, this is our thing, and this is how we do it, and it's different than anyone else. I mean, how did that happen?
Well, I just think it's mostly just like a general interest in technology and things that are happening in culture.
Yeah.
Just in general, being interested in things and exploring things. And then, if we do a technique, we'll do a technique, 3 or 4 times on a shoot, and then we will ditch it and try and come up with something new.
Really?
I think because unless we're being pulled back into that world for, say, a commercial project or something. Just because we also get tired of it.
Right.
It's like a sort of restlessness is like we are trying and the work where the music, at least as far as the musicians and the music work that we do, which is sort of like what's most interesting, at least as far as we go, you're dealing with people who are also very interested in avant-garde art and culture and trying to push their own medium. So you kind of have to keep up with them in certain ways. And it's not fashion shoots, and it's necessarily where there's a new piece of clothing. You're basically shooting a similar type of thing all the time, whether it's a musician or something about a hip hop artist or something like the material itself is often the same thing in front of the camera. So you have to build this world around it that's unique for each subject, and that in and of itself is makes it so that you have to continue to push your own craft, so that, if you're not given new subject matter, you have to be the one to create the subject matter to a certain degree.
Yeah, definitely. And I know you just mentioned working with artists, and I know you worked with big brands before. This might not be a black and white answer, but have you noticed one might be more willing to take some creative risks than the other, or how does that work between artists and brands?
Well, I think now it used to be that the artists, when I was first shooting, it was mostly indie artists, like bands. They tended to be quite conservative with their image. Then moving into the more electronic world, you're dealing with a lot of artists who are they're like more like studio gangsters. They're less interested in having their own celebrity celebrated in the imagery, and they're more interested in pushing the visuals into a more abstract place. So that works well for us.
Yeah.
The brands themselves, but oddly, even though often hip hop artists tend to, their music or production is sometimes quite futuristic. more futuristic than even, pure electronic music, but they can sometimes tend to be a bit more conservative, or you'll do a very experimental shoot with them, but then they pick the more typical celebrity imagery from it. I think people like the idea of being avant-garde, but they still want to look cool.
Right.
I don't think that's changing, but for brands, there's often like very, very good creative directors at the brands who have really good ideas and come to us to like execute those ideas. But as it moves up the chain of command, since all the brands are kind of owned by very similar companies at this point, that can kind of get distilled a bit. But
right.
some of what we try to do with the imagery is like bake into the image the actual techniques. So if there's like trails or some like interesting effect, we try to shoot it in the camera so that you can't necessarily go back and remove that. If someone decides it went too far, we'll still always shoot safety images, but we try and make the color and the lighting and everything in the camera, so that it has at least some of the flavor of our work in it that can't necessarily be removed. But it's definitely a case by case basis. Sometimes you think an artist is going to be very open minded, and they really just want a cool looking image. Sometimes the brands you think are going to be difficult end up being the most creative, but it's definitely case by case. But there's a lot of really amazing creative directors who grew up who grew up from listening to a lot of the music and musicians we work with, and they kind of want that world in their images much more so than say I would guess, not that I was working in the 90s as a photographer, but if you look at the work from the 90s, it's much more kind of documentary style. It's not as like experimental, mixing mediums and 3D and things like that. And now this group of creative directors of this generation is definitely more clued into that whole world, thanks to Instagram and previously Tumblr and things like that. And that has really worked well for us because that's the world that we're more interested in.
Right. No, and just, and getting to one of these recent things that you've done, one of the recent projects, and you mentioned you're living in the Run to Jewels apartment earlier, or in their building. I mean, I'm looking at the image that you shot for the single cover, and I mean, it's just amazing and beautiful. And again, it has that car theme in the earlier video that you shot, I guess years ago.
Yeah, for LP.
Yeah. Tell us about this shot here. Like, how did this come together? Was this your vision? Was it their vision?
Well, with Run the Jewels and with LP in particular, he's basically the creative director. At least every project I've worked on, he has a very clear vision of what the music world is that they're working in for each album, how to elevate it from the one before. And it's a process of basically him and I meeting, he has a basic idea for this single, the car, the Grand Royal car, or Buick Royal, is Killer Mike's car.
Oh, okay.
And it was featured as an illustration in one of the previous albums. Now Mike also is very interested in these dioramas of Hot Wheel cars where you use cotton or like little sets to like make it look like the tires are burning out and smoke coming out of the car and things like that. So L's idea, which is kind of crazy, was to make a full-size version of something that looked like a tiny diorama with them in the car based on a previous illustration they had, which I thought was like maybe not possible because it's such a crazy idea, but I was so inspired by it that I we met with amazing set designer we work with, Maddie and figured out like an approach to get this kind of Fellini-esque type of cotton smoke cloud thing made, and basically just executed his idea on this like very large scale, bringing in the lighting that we do and the team that we have and the color schemes that we have. And then Mike came to set and, made some little adjustments to make sure it was like accurate to how the car would actually have the smoke come out of it. So it didn't look like the engine was blowing up. It was more like the wheels were burning. Like it required a lot of different people's expertise to make that particular image, which is usually how these things are. Like we're more like directing a team of people around us based on concepts that we have and trying to elevate the idea.
And they come in and try to execute the vision with you.
Yeah, like they come in, we work together as a team. The set designer comes in, builds the smoke. We're working again with the monitors, looking at it live. It's very collaborative. There's not like one person directing any one thing. We're all working on it together. And then Mike and LP would come in and they have their feedback. We make adjustments live, so that everyone, has their say in it, feels involved, and like has their expertise, making sure that it's what the vision should be.
Right.
Then we execute it, bring it to that one in particular. We brought to the retoucher just to clean up certain elements, but it is for the most part all a live set in the camera.
So cool.
Made by like a team of like 30 people.
Wow. Oh, it's that big of a crew for that shot.
Yeah, because we need like our team and then we have the photography crew, the lighting team, the studio team who's there, the team doing the actual set and the smoke and the clouds and keeping the car clean. That's probably another 8 or 9 people.
Wow.
Stylists, hair and makeup people. These things are like small armies of people, even for some of the simplest things.
The whole production.
You're coming in there just like coordinating things like an orchestra at that point. I mean, there's a lot of moving parts, right?
There's a lot of moving parts, and their time is ticking because you have to get into the studio and get out in 10 hours and get this image, and you're not quite sure if it's going to work ever until it's in front of the camera. And usually the first things don't work, so you have to figure out how to make it work with what you have in the time you have.
Right.
That's sometimes the hardest part. But yeah, for something like this, in particular, because the vision was so strong, there wasn't a lot of exploring on set, techniques. Usually there's not even time to do that. Like Dina and I will explore techniques in our own studio before we go into the actual shoot, because there's just not enough time to experiment if the experiment fails. And so we fail, on our own until we get to the point where we're comfortable with a technique or idea or color look or something like that. Because basically the way photography is shot now, you're not shooting something in a camera and you process the film 2 days later and no one sees it. You're working in front of an audience of 30 plus people with a giant monitor where everyone can see it. If it looks terrible, it doesn't ever look terrible, but it's still the pressure is very different. You're very different than it has been in the past. It's a performance.
You're performing in real time.
Yeah.
There is a performance aspect to it.
Right. And I think
that helps. That's why you have to be a clear communicator about like what you're trying to execute.
Yeah, definitely.
I guess, and then, you've obviously done a lot of video work. Are you gravitating more to visual photography with 3D, or are you thinking more video in terms of what you really are inspired by? Well,
the video, it's exponentially more time consuming than photography because you're shooting, 24 individual photographs per second.
Right.
There's a lot more people involved in the process, but unfortunately in the last few years, because of this like pivot to video for a lot of media outlets, there's not necessarily been, even if it takes 10 times as long, there's not 10 times the budget of a photograph.
Right.
So it'll be interesting to see where that leads to. Right. But basically, if it's, basically what decides whether it's going to be a video or a photograph is some things just lend themselves to being a video. If it's a piece that needs to be in motion, but normally at this point, if it's something, say for Nike or a sports brand or even a fashion brand, they want to have both video and photography. And since we do both, that's really helpful. But then if you want to start adding in more of the 3D elements and the design elements, it just gets extremely time consuming to make those things move. So you might shoot similar. Sorry, go ahead. No, go ahead.
I was going to say, so you might shoot that similar idea in the studio and then shoot a video around that same concept?
Yeah, we do. Yeah, we do that all the time. Mm-hmm. So we'll have if it's a celebrity piece, generally like you have time constraints as how much time you have with the celebrity. Right. So say it's a piece where we have like someone like something with like Ronaldo or like soccer player or something, and we need to get a shot of him like kicking the ball a certain way. but they also want a motion piece. We'll build a set so that we have both the lights for the still and the lights for the motion on the same set. And we basically just switch the cameras out. We shoot the stills first to make sure we have like that imagery and the rehearsal to get the stills first. And then we'll put the motion camera in and capture the motion aspect on the same set so that they have assets for their, often it's for social media or something like that.
Sure.
So in that way, it's been very helpful that I know how to do video.
Right.
That's great.
And sometimes they don't even know why they want that, the clients. They just know that someone's going to ask for it. I mean, I love the clients, so we try and give them as much as possible.
Of course.
But and I think sometimes, not with the main clients, but I think sometimes some clients underestimate how much more it costs to do video, how many more people it takes, how much more lighting it takes. And so that's always like usually a discussion that has to be had to say, is it worth the extra $80,000 to get 15-second clip?
Right.
Or is there another way to approach this problem? Like sometimes we take a still and then have things animated in 3D around it, which is something we did recently for this brand Kaiman, where we had 3D. We shot still photography, very high resolution with phase 1 cameras, and then had 3D models made of the people, of the subjects who were in them. Those 3D models were animated and we reprojected our photographs onto them. So it had the texture of the clothing, the look of that models, and we didn't actually have to shoot any actual live action motion. And it made for quite an interesting avant-garde piece. Or we'll do something where we have a cinematograph type thing where we shoot someone jumping, but we want these objects floating around them. So instead of shooting the objects and compositing them, we'll shoot the still frame of the person jumping, have the objects made in 3D, also not extremely cheap, but still probably, according to our budget, was cheaper than actually shooting the pieces, and have those objects basically animated on a still photograph.
Wow.
It's really cool.
That's cool. That's cool that you can combine those ideas and get multiple assets made.
Yes.
So I guess, final couple questions. You mentioned some things that you did when you were coming up in your career, but for all the, creatives out there listening, what's some advice that you have for younger photographers, filmmakers, creatives, especially in this industry now and this market? Like what are some like pieces of advice that you give?
Well, if I was starting out now there's a lot of benefits to the internet, because not only do you have access to a lot of different references, but you can also have a place to show your work, where in the past you had to go through agents and they would have printed portfolios and things of that nature. But also because of that, you start to notice that a lot of the work looks ubiquitous. It looks very similar. People are pulling from the same reference points, and people are not caring that much about craft. They don't know much about lighting because they're not necessarily going and being assistants and learning lighting from someone who knows how to do it. They just want to be the photographer, which I understand. But if you don't have some kind of apprenticeship, you're always going to be limited by what you can learn on your own. So my advice would be, for one, to try and apprentice for people who are older and have a little bit more experience than you do. And people who do work that you're really interested in. Another piece of advice would be to have influences that are outside of the internet. Have actual interest. Be interested in science or art, or if you're interested in sports or whatever it is that you're interested in that has nothing to do with the thing that you're actually making, and go to the bookstore and look at things that are not on the internet and have those be your influence, rather than whatever it is that Kanye is talking about that week, or Travis Scott or something like that. Because it's true. It's like those things are very tempting to be attracted to and feel like you're part of something, which is good to know what's going on in the zeitgeist, but it's not going to give you any unique take on something.
Right.
Yeah, that's interesting. Have your other interests inspire you.
Yes. Read a book.
We'll tell our creative team that. I like that.
We've got some assignments for people after this call.
Yeah.
That's great.
Yeah.
So summary is basically find other people that you can partner and learn from, explore things that are not on the internet, which I think is a great piece of advice today, where it's just like everything is about your computer, and like get out of the box, explore your mind, and find those ideas.
Go to the library, go to the museum.
Yeah.
even go to the zoo and look at bizarre animals or flowers or things and just understand like why the functionality of that, thing that you're interested in exists, and whether it's in nature or science or something like that. And even if you don't apply it directly, you might get inspired by, say, like a lot of the colors we use and things are inspired by like deep sea creatures and bioluminescence and things of that nature. They're not necessarily inspired by other photographs, or they're inspired by like deep space images or dark matter or something, of that nature, which you don't necessarily. There's a lot more out there in the world than what's on the Instagram.
True, very true.
And I guess to kind of wrap up here, what's next for Setta Studio? I mean, I know you said you're working on some things for Run the Jewels. What else is coming up for you guys?
Yeah, we're working on Run the Jewels projects. We have probably half a dozen projects that have been shot that we're finishing. A lot of music projects, a lot of like multimedia projects with some of our 3D friends. We're going to have like a studio on the West Coast as well as New York now, so we can be shooting more of out of the studio, more and more landscape series and things like that. And then hopefully we'll be doing a book of work in the next year or so.
That's great. That's in LA, your studio?
Pardon me?
That's a studio in LA?
We'll have a studio in LA and then a space in New York.
Oh, cool.
So we can work locally in either place and kind of get influenced by the outdoors a little bit more, rather than in the like smoke-filled laser-filled studio that we usually have in New York.
That's so cool.
Yeah.
Awesome. And Maddie, any other questions for Tim?
No, I think you covered them all. Thank you so much for being a part of this. It was really interesting.
Yeah, and it's really fun.
I really appreciate your time, Tim, to reconnect. Hopefully we'll be coming to visit your studio post all this stuff that we're dealing with now.
Fantastic.
We can do a elbow bump or something like that.
An in-person elbow bump.
So once
let me ask you.
Yeah, go ahead.
Let me ask you, would you put a link to work with this interview?
Sure.
Of course.
Yeah.
Because I'll send you the Behance site, which is mostly where the Setta Studio work is.
I saw that you have a Tumblr.
And the Instagram. We have a Tumblr, Instagram, and the Behance website, which is where we dump most of the Setta Studio.
Is something that you find connecting with other creatives has been helpful? Or just people coming there? Dina is very an excellent curator and editor, and so she does most of the social media aspects as far as laying out the images and choosing them. And she just found that the Behance pages, because the images are so big, our work is shot very, very high resolution on really big cameras. You can really appreciate it a lot more on Behance.
Oh, yeah.
And we use Behance more to connect with people. Instagram, we like, but it's obviously more like a social tool rather than a portfolio tool.
Right.
They all have their own uses. If I was starting out now, or if we were just starting, we might not even end up having an actual traditional website in the end, because people barely even look at those anymore.
Right.
That's true.
Behance, I guess you can have bigger files and stuff as well.
Oh yeah, and it's huge. The interface is really great. Yeah. And obviously that's how Adobe, found us to do that little piece about us, which is great. And the Adobe people are very supportive of the creative community.
Yeah, definitely.
It just feels like a good fit.
Yeah, you should speak at the Max conference. I mean, you'd be perfect for that.
Well, Dina and I went and spoke at their headquarters.
Oh, you did?
Months ago or two, to a select group of people, 30 or 40 people.
Yeah.
And cool. That went really well. So maybe we'll ask about that.
Yeah, that's cool.
Yeah, that'd be awesome.
They're all really lovely people over
Amazing.
there.
They're so
great.
Smart. All right, Tim. Well, thank you again for your time.
Yes, thank you so much.
And we want to see more of what Setta Studios has coming up this year. We're super excited for you. Stay safe and healthy, and we hope to connect with you in person soon.
Okay, thank you guys.
Thank you.